All right, this is the second half of chapter 27, where we'll talk about all of the things that were sort of going on just under the kind of 1950s veneer that we think of, anyways. Whenever we picture in the 1950s, these are the unseen parts, as the book calls it, the other America. Popular culture tended to focus mainly on the affluent Americans who were enjoying the good life after the war, but poverty and racial discrimination were rife and quite dire, and the struggles for social injustice intensified during the 1950s and continued to intensify into the next decades after that. Although the percentage of poor families who were defined officially as a family of four that made less than $3,000 a year, although that percentage was declining, you still have, in 1960, about 35 million Americans who were living below the poverty line still. The bulk of the poor were sort of clustered into the rather decaying inner city slums in urban areas. Um, and the poor in America often tended to live in a kind of vicious cycle, which trapped them in poverty. Um, they were unable to afford good housing, nutritious diet, or doctors, and so the poor quite often got sick, much more often than their affluent counterparts, and for much longer than their affluent counterparts. Being out sick caused them to lose wages and made it much more difficult to find steady jobs, so that they couldn't pay for decent housing or good food or doctors, which would keep them from getting sick, so that they wouldn't lose wages. And so you just have this kind of vicious cycle that essentially works to keep people in poverty and makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to break out of it. Children of the poor tended to start school already disadvantaged, and as a result, very quickly fell behind from everyone else, and lacking any kind of encouragement of expectation or success, often dropped out. And so you essentially have generational poverty, where impoverished parents, the only thing that they essentially leave behind to their children is even more poverty. And in fact, Lyndon Johnson later, when he sort of extols his Great Society programs, uses the analogy of a foot race where one runner is unencumbered and one runner is running with shackles, even though they may start in the same place. The runner who is shackled, essentially, is unable to run as fast, and so they very quickly fall behind. And if we look at the race as a relay race, the next generation is well behind because of the disadvantage that is essentially being passed on to them by their parents and grandparents and so on and so forth. So it was definitely what you would call a vicious cycle. The pressing need for low-cost housing quite often went unanswered. Things like slum clearance usually meant clearing out people that we didn't want, quite often Negro clearance. And urban renewal quite often meant poor renewal, which is essentially forcing low-income families out of the inner cities in order to make room for bigger and better things. So it wasn't necessarily created in order to aid these poorer Americans. Landlords, realtors, bankers all deliberately excluded any kind of non-whites from decent housing as well, and so it's an additional burden that these people had to deal with. High unemployment on the Caribbean islands and the advent of direct air service from New York to the Caribbean islands brought a steady stream of Puerto Ricans into New York City after 1945, and the Puerto Rican population ballooned following that, most of them settling in the sort of East Harlem area. In New York, Puerto Ricans suffered from inadequate housing, employment, schools, from police harassment, and various things like that. Countless earlier immigrants managed to gain greater personal freedom in the United States while losing the security of a strong cultural tradition. So essentially, in order to gain any kind of real security or advancement in the United States, you had to abandon what you were before, which could be considered either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your point of view. Yet, however much a lot of these immigrants tried to embrace American ways, many could not enjoy the promise of the so-called American dream because of their language or their race, essentially, the color of their skin, and dealt with discrimination based on these things. They turned instead to organizations who sought to end discrimination against Puerto Ricans and others within the cities. Mexican Americans also suffered the same kind of indignities. Most were underpaid and segregated away from mainstream American life. After the Second World War, new irrigation systems added about 7.5 million acres of agricultural lands in the Southwest, making previously unfarmable land into quite profitable agricultural land. This stimulated the demand for cheap labor, and cheap Mexican labor was the easiest answer to that problem. In order to stem the resulting tide of illegal Mexican immigrants, Congress reintroduced the wartime temporary worker program, which would bring in seasonal laborers, the Bracero program, as it was called. However, many of them stayed without authorization and joined in the growing number of Latinos who entered the country illegally anyways. During the period of 1953 to 1955, there was a kind of slight recession in the United States, and it's during this period that the government instituted what became known as Operation Wetback, where the government forcibly deported some 3 million allegedly undocumented entrants into the United States. Allegedly undocumented because there were some legal immigrants in the United States that got forcibly deported as well. In much the same way that during the Great Depression, we also forcibly deported some legal immigrants and some who were American citizens, which they got deported as well, and the same thing happened then. These kind of periodic roundups, however, didn't stop the flow of millions of Mexicans and others coming across into the border. The Bracero program itself peaked in 1959, where about 450,000 workers were admitted. Associations were formed, but they were not able to stop the exploitation or the widespread violations of rights against Mexican American citizens. About 85% of Mexican Americans lived in urban areas by 1970, and urbanization provided better educational as well as employment opportunities for them. And so they were less and less willing to be the migrant farm workers that had characterized many previous generations. These organizations campaigned to end discrimination and segregation and managed to win some very important court decisions which declared school segregation of Mexican Americans unconstitutional, and also ended other various forms of injustices. But the existence of millions of undocumented aliens and the continuation of the Bracero program still worked to stigmatize Hispanics in the sort of American consciousness, and so it remained quite a big problem, regardless of the small gains that were made. For Native Americans, they remained, by and large, the poorest minority in the United States. They had a death rate nearly 3 times the national average. Unemployment rates on reservations during the 1950s reached into the 70s or the 80s percentiles for some tribes. Congress again changed course, so you have a constant change in policy with regards to Native Americans. So earlier in the semester we talked about the Dawes Act and things like that, which sought to essentially do away with the reservations to give individual families or individuals plots of land and turn them into sort of farmers, essentially, and do away with communal land ownership and various things, tribal things like that. During the New Deal, you had a push to undo that sort of Dawes legacy and to reassert sovereignty for the tribes and some form of cultural autonomy. And in this period now, in the 1950s, we're moving away from that, from emphasis on tribal sovereignty and cultural autonomy, and back towards the kind of Dawes idea of assimilation into American culture. Proponents of these measures argued that it would increase self-sufficiency, but this policy also would serve to reduce federal services. They acted to sell off tribal lands and then push several off the reservations and into a kind of world that they were ill-equipped to deal with, essentially taking already impoverished people and pushing them into the wider society where they remain impoverished and enter into that vicious cycle that dominated poverty generally in America. And so the result was actually disastrous. In order to lure Native Americans off their land, and into urban areas, which would also speed the sale of land to developers, as the advert here on the page would imply, there were incentives provided. They would pay moving costs. There would be assistance in finding housing and jobs, living expenses until they could find work. But it often was less helpful than it was purported to be, or than they sold it as, I suppose. By 1960, about 60,000 Native Americans had been relocated to the cities. Some managed to become middle class, generally while also having to lose a lot of their Native American identity. And some ended up on the welfare rolls, living in sort of rundown shanty towns and addicted to alcohol and other things. Nearly a third, however, re-entered the reservations because they were unable to get any real sort of life or satisfaction out of the movement off the reservations. And so again, we have essentially what is a continuation of testy relations between the United States government, the sort of white European United States, and the Native American United States, a relationship which has never been particularly comfortable and continues to remain uncomfortable in this period. Another large part of 1950 society was you have the emergence of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Somewhat fearful of assertiveness by the black community, who were seeking the vote and who were sort of mobilizing this grassroots movement, white Americans, at least some white Americans, accelerated their own repression and violence sort of in response to that. In 1946, several black veterans were killed in Georgia for daring to vote, and at least one soldier was blinded for failing to sit in the rear of a bus in South Carolina, and there were similar incidents happening throughout the country with sort of lynchings and riots and other things like that. All of these events horrified President Truman. He was very much aware of the importance to the Democratic Party of the growing African American vote, and he also realized that the level of white racism in this country was not only damaging to us as a society, as an American society, but also damaging to our image abroad. And it was kind of damaging to our foreign relations as well. He genuinely believed that every American should enjoy the full rights of citizenship, and so established the President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1946 to investigate race relations in the country. He called following the committee's report, called for the eradication of racial discrimination and segregation, and proposed anti-lynching and anti-poll tax legislation and an enactment of a permanent FEPC, which was an organization created with the goal of essentially ending discrimination. Truman sent a special message to Congress in February of 1948 urging lawmakers to enact these proposals. Most of the actions would fall short of his rhetoric, as the president insisted on closing the gap between the nation's ideals and its racist practices. He resorted to issuing a lot of executive orders and other things like that, although, again, falling well short of his ultimate goals. During Truman's presidency, the Supreme Court declared segregation in interstate bus transportation to be unconstitutional and also outlawed restrictive housing covenants, which forbade the sale or rental of property to minorities. Reflecting on the sort of growing determination of Black Americans to demand their rights, the NAACP, their chief attorney, Thurgood Marshall, who would eventually become a Supreme Court justice, abandoned the call for greater equality within the separate but equal and chose instead to attack the very doctrine of separate but equal itself. And so, in May of 1954, the new Chief Justice, who was appointed by Eisenhower, Earl Warren, speaking on behalf of a unanimous court, reversed officially the separate but equal doctrine that was set down originally in Plessy v. Ferguson in the case that was argued by Thurgood Marshall before the court in 1954. The case was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. This case managed to overturn more than 60 years of legal segregation, as the court ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal, and therefore the doctrine of separate but equal was untenable, essentially. In the border states, some African American and white students were now sitting side by side for the first time in their classes, but in the South, where segregation was the most deeply entrenched in law as well as in custom, you have vows from politicians to resist the order from the court. And Eisenhower refused to force them to comply with it, making the statement, "I don't believe you can change the hearts of men with laws or decisions." Ike wasn't sort of personally racist, but he never publicly endorsed the Brown decision and actually called his appointment of Earl Warren a mistake when he appointed him to the Supreme Court. Encouraged by this lack of decision on the part of the president, white citizens' councils organized to defend segregation, and you see a revival of the Ku Klux Klan in response as well. In 1956, more than 100 members of Congress signed the Southern Manifesto, which denounced the Brown decision, and that year not a single African American attended school with whites in the Deep South, and very few did so in other regions in the Upper South. This resistance reached a climax in 1957, full 3 years after the decision was handed down. Although the Little Rock School Board had accepted the federal court order to desegregate at least one of its schools, Central High School, the governor of Arkansas mobilized the state's National Guard to block the students from entering the school. There was 9 students who were slated to attend, 9 Black American students who were slated to attend the school, and the National Guard was called out to keep the students out. Eisenhower believed that he had to uphold federal authority in this case, and so nationalized the Arkansas National Guard, called them essentially to federal duty, and this was kept, or they were deployed then to keep the black students safe as they attended the school, and they were there throughout the academic school year. The picture here, as you can see, it's one of the more iconic images that comes out of this decision. And here you have a student, Elizabeth Eckford, who's only 15 years old, going into the school at Central High School while you have this group behind her, arrayed behind her. And you can see one woman in particular who looks like she's shouting something rather angry at her. And I've always found it quite interesting, just sort of how serene and how uncaring Elizabeth looks, despite all of this that's going on behind her. And I suspect it takes a fair amount of courage. Local authorities in Little Rock eventually shut down the public schools the next year, and by the end of the decade, fewer than 1% of African American students in the Deep South attended desegregated schools. It was clear at this point that court victories alone would not suffice to eradicate Jim Crow provisions, and nor would the passage of weak legislation. And so something else was now required in order to enact real change. That something else that was needed ended up being more direct protest. In order to sweep away the separate but equal Jim Crow type facilities, you see the formation of a grassroots insurgency among African Americans who turned to new tactics, new organizations, and new leaders as well. They often utilize nonviolent direct action protests in order to engage large numbers in the freedom struggle and to arouse the conscience of white America. In the 1950s, racism still touched even the smallest details of life. In Montgomery, Alabama, black bus riders had to surrender their seats so that no white rider would be left standing, even though they were more than 3/4 of the passengers on Montgomery's bus system. They also had to pay their fares at the front of the bus, then leave, and then go around and enter the bus on the back rather than just walking through. And it's all these little indignities that start to add up. And finally, on December 1st, 1955, one particular woman, a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, also a prominent member of the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama, by the name of Rosa Parks, refused to get up so that a white gentleman could sit down, or I suppose gentleman's probably the wrong word, man could sit down. She says later, in describing the incident, "I was not tired physically. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." And there's another quote I've read by her that said that something to the effect that she needed to essentially test her citizenship, her personhood, exactly how worthy she was of being a person, and so decided to use that as her test. She was arrested, and her arrest sparked other black leaders who had been engaged in the struggle in Montgomery to propose a boycott of the bus system, which began the sort of mass phase of the civil rights movement. They elected Martin Luther King Jr., who was a 27-year-old preacher, to lead the boycott. In Montgomery, black Americans who were inspired by earlier protests as well as by Brown trudged the streets. They organized carpools, raised thousands of dollars in order to carry on the fight. Those who operated taxi services provided them at a reduced rate so that the workers could get to work without having to utilize the public transportation. And when city leaders refused to budge, they persisted. The boycott went on for more than a year until finally the Supreme Court ordered that the buses be desegregated. The boycott demonstrated the strength of the community as well as their determination, and it shattered the myth that any in the black community approved of segregation and that it was just outside agitators that opposed Jim Crow. This gave undeniable proof that it was those living in the Jim Crow South that wanted out of the Jim Crow system, wanted Jim Crow done away with. Martin Luther King's philosophy of civil disobedience fused the spirit of Christianity with the strategy of achieving racial justice by nonviolent resistance. Direct action gave everyone in the community an opportunity to demonstrate the moral evil of racial discrimination. And his insistence on nonviolence also diminished the likelihood of bloodshed, but it also made the protesters more sympathetic to the rest of the American population. In 1957, King and a wider group of black ministers formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in order to carry on the nonviolent protest against the evils of second-class citizenship. As a kind of foreshadowing of the activism that we'll see in later years, 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to have lunch at a Woolworth's on February 1st, 1960. They sat down at the counter and were very promptly told that Woolworths didn't serve their kind there on the counter. However, they refused to give up. They remained seated, refused to move despite attempts to make them, sometimes violent attempts to make them. They vowed to sit in until they were served, and a full 6 months later, after prolonged sit-ins, Greensboro civic leaders grudgingly allowed, following these massive sit-ins and demonstrations, they were joined in by hundreds of other students, actually, as well, and civic leaders grudgingly allowed blacks to sit down at hitherto segregated restaurants in order to be served. This example catalyzed a similar sort of wave of sit-ins throughout the border states in the Upper South. Those who took part endured beatings, cigarette burnings, tear gassings, and even jailings in their attempts to desegregate eating facilities in this way. They also enacted the same sort of tactics in other public spaces. They had sleep-ins in motel lobbies, wade-ins on restricted beaches, read-ins at public libraries and other such facilities. However, they stayed true to the nonviolent principles and refused to retaliate regardless of what may have been done to them. The determination of these students transformed the struggle for racial equality, emboldened by adults and other youth to act. They also generated a sense of self-esteem as well as strength. One student claimed, "I myself desegregated a lunch counter, not somebody else, not some big man, some powerful man, but little me." And so it gives you definitely a sense of your self-worth to be able to participate directly like that. Newly encouraged and emboldened by this, the Congress of Racial Equality organized freedom rides throughout the Deep South in 1961. This aroused wrath of protesters. Mobs beat the freedom riders in places like Anniston, Alabama. They burned their bus and mauled protesters in Birmingham, which meant that the freedom rides were now front page news. A week later, scores of racist Southerners in Montgomery beat freedom riders with bats and iron chains, which generated international publicity, indignation, and sympathy for the riders. This ultimately forced the Interstate Commerce Commission to require the desegregation of all interstate carriers and terminals. Many of the Freedom Riders went on to become members, founding members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In order to form, they also formed, essentially forming their own independent organization, which stressed both nonviolent civil disobedience and the need to stimulate local activism and leadership. Volunteers spread throughout the South in places like Mississippi, organizing voting rights campaigns and sit-ins. In Georgia, they had campaigns to desegregate public facilities and secure the vote as well. Local authorities caught on to the idea that violent reaction tended to breed sympathy, and so managed to avoid a lot of the violence that had won national sympathy for the Freedom Riders uh, in Albany, Georgia, specifically, and the movement there collapsed as a result of essentially the lack of response or overt response. This meant that the leaders of that movement learned a valuable lesson. Only the provocation of cruel, vicious, racist violence would generate the national publicity that was needed in order to force the federal government to intervene to protect the rights of Black Americans. And so you see, as a result, the nonviolent part of the protests kind of falling by the wayside. The protesters themselves don't initiate violence. They begin to plan strategically places where they will incite the most violent reaction in order to get to achieve the goal that they have in mind. So last but not least, a topic that we touched on at least a little bit in both classes, sort of changing atmosphere between the generations. As I read in class, few adults considered the implications of affluence for the young or the consequence of having a teenage generation stay in school instead of working. Few pondered how the young would respond to growing up in an age where traditional values like thrift and self-denial had declining relevance, or to maturing when young people had the leisure and money to shape their own subculture. And this presents an interesting conundrum. Previous generations had grown up in the First World War. You have the excesses of the 20s, but they're relatively short-lived, as we're then slammed with the difficulties of the Great Depression and the need for thrift and self-reliance and hard work in order to achieve even the most basic standard of living. And then we immediately plunged into the Second World War, where Americans had to ration and they had to moderate their behavior in order to support the war effort. And those sorts of practices undoubtedly affect the way that you view the world and the way that you look at things. If you remember from my lecture on the Great Depression, I talked about my grandmother who would save the tiniest spoonful of food, put it away in the refrigerator and save it for a rainy day. And this is in the 1970s, 1980s, where she would come to my parents' house and they'd have dinner, and there may be like one spoonful of corn left, and she would put that tablespoon of corn in a container, and my mom would have to put it in the fridge, and then Mom would toss it out after Gran left. And in fact, that's a perfect illustration of the effect of affluence on our worldview, on our perception. My grandmother was still saving, tablespoons of corn because she grew up in an era, the Great Depression, the Second World War, where that sort of thrift was necessary for life. My mother was born in 1958, a baby boomer through and through, and my mother grew up in an age of affluence, this age of affluence that we're talking about, where teenagers don't have to work. They can stay in school. And in the fact that the things that my grandmother would save, my mother would then go after she left and throw away, is a very good analogy, a very good explanation of just how much this changes how we look at the world. And so you start to see the roots of that change in this generation. Rock and roll was the big sort of controversial youth movement of the 1950s. And it was so because it was so different from anything that was considered mainstream previously. Um, and the reaction against it by those older generations who probably didn't understand it at all was vehement. Some saw it as a communist plot to corrupt the youth, although it's kind of silly when you think about it because rock and roll music was banned in places like the Soviet Union. Segregationists claimed that it was a ploy to mix the races because the origins of rock and roll come out of the performances of black musicians and the sort of African tradition as far as music goes. Psychiatrists feared that it was a communicable disease, that you could sort of catch the rock and roll bug. And churches condemned it as the devil's music, that it was somehow undermining the moral fiber of America's youth. No one embodied that particular worry quite so well as Elvis Presley, with his upbeat, sort of interesting music, and his rather gyrating pelvic movements that defined the sort of dances. And so that was particularly prominent as far as the idea that it was devil's music. But the more and more that adults condemned rock and roll, the more and more teenagers relished its assault on mainstream values. They also cherished rock and roll for defying the kind of adult propriety, if you like. Characters like James Dean's character in Rebel Without a Cause were elevated to kind of cult-like status because they rejected society's mores. They delighted in reading Mad magazine because it ridiculed the rather phony pretensions of the middle class. They would customize their cars because it was essentially a symbolic rejection of automakers' standards. All of these are signs of distinctiveness from the rather adult world. You have a distinctive teenage culture. Nonconformist writers, also known as the Beats, expressed a more fundamental revolt against middle-class society. They scorned things like conformity, religion, family values, and materialism as being square America. They romanticized society's outcasts, glorified uninhibited sexuality and spontaneity in their search for it, this ultimate authentic experience. The mass media scorned the Beats, as they did all dissenters, but some college youth admired this rejection of conformity. And together, the Beats, rock and roll music, and these college students who are just beginning to sort of emerge out of this silent generation that characterized earlier students in the 1950s, they're starting to reveal the sort of the unsteadiness, the chaos which is brewing just below the surface of complacent American society. And they are the heralds of the youth movement that ultimately explode in the next decade of the 1960s.